All right, thank you. All right, guys, welcome back. We're going to be doing endocrine system today. Now, get out your pencil and paper. This is a little bit harder of a lecture. It's more in-depth material. I'm going to be lecturing off book a little bit, okay? As soon as I get to a question you don't understand, pause the tape, write the question down, come see me during my office hours, shoot me an email, or look it up in your book, okay? This is definitely less street shooting than bones and muscles were, okay? So endocrine system. How about those glands? Once again, we're going to be talking about glands, okay? Okay, so endocrine system, an overview and a little bit of a review. If you could think way back to ANP1 when we talked about tissues. We talked about glands and two major groupings of glands. We had endocrine and we had exocrine. Okay, so we're going to be talking about endocrine. I'm going to just refresh your memory about exocrine. Exocrine, were glands that secreted by a duct to a surface. Okay, sweat is a perfect example of an exocrine gland. Endocrine gland is a gland that secretes substances to the bloodstream. Okay, so they secrete different substances, but they also secrete to different areas. Exocrine is going to secrete by a duct to a surface. Endocrine is going to secrete directly to the bloodstream. The similarities between them is they're both made up of epithelium. If you could think back once again to ANP1, epithelium is closely packed cells. So both of these have closely packed cells that are organized in different ways. So that gives them the similarities. The differences are where they secrete to and what they secrete. Okay, so we're not going to talk about exocrine anymore. I just want you to remember that concept. We're going to move on and talk about endocrine. Okay, endocrine, this is going to be deceiving because this is a short packet of notes, but endocrine is a very complex subject. The reason endocrine is complex is because hormones are released into the bloodstream. They go out to the entire body. They can affect a multitude of areas, one specific area, okay, and not another area. So it gets very confusing as to where the hormones are released from, where they are going to, and whether they're going to affect that target tissue or not. Okay? So hormones are chemical messengers. We release very little of these chemical messengers in this little teeny tiny bit, like kilograms of hormones that are released into the bloodstream will affect target tissues in very major ways. Okay? You can see the things that are listed below: growth, reproduction, immunity, electrolyte balances, balances of sugars, okay, metabolism, which is building up or breaking down of substances. Now, some cells can produce hormones too. We've talked in ANP1 about tissue damage. We've got front lines of defense. If I were to take a big machete out and cut my arm, I would have an immediate inflammatory response in that area. There are hormonal messengers that are secreted in that area immediately that will affect the immune system, draw more white blood cells, and act as macrophages. Okay, so the hormones don't act as macrophages, but stimulate the release of macrophages. Hormones will be released in this area, but we also have hormones that will be released from glands and sent out by the blood. Here it begins. Get the notebook out. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Okay. Hormones are either amino acid based or steroid based. Okay, so hormones are amino acid based or steroid based. If you could think back to ANP1 once again, groupings of amino acids in long chains eventually form a protein. Okay, so these hormones can either be a protein or a steroid. Now, a steroid is going to be a fatty substance that's derived from cholesterol. It's going to be in a ring shape, if you sort of remember back from ANP1, okay? And that steroid base is going to be very specific grouping of hormones. So I'm going to zoom in on the whiteboard, okay, and we're going to list off that grouping of steroid-based cells, okay? And the reason I'm going to list off the steroid-based cells is because the rest of the hormones primarily are going to be protein-based, okay? So steroid-based, and let me see if that's big enough. Yeah, I'll write a little bit bigger. This says steroid-based are going to be estrogen, so they're called as a grouping gonadal hormones. Estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Okay. These are called gonadal hormones. Estrogen and progesterone are predominant hormones in females. Testosterone, there you go. Testosterone is going to be the predominant hormone in males. Now, does this mean that males have no estrogen and progesterone? No, they do. They have small amounts of it, not as much as a female. Does this mean that females do not have testosterone? Nope. Once again, that's going to be lesser amounts than it would be in a male. Okay. They are steroid-based. They're derived from cholesterol. And they have different functions, which we're really going to go into when we get into reproductive. We're going to go into the specific functions when we get into reproductive. So those three. The other steroid-based hormones are called adrenal, or I should say are from the adrenal cortex. Okay, so just make a note of this. On the next slide or two, I'm going to show you where the adrenal cortex is. So the adrenal cortex is going to release a grouping of hormones that are steroid-based as well. So estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and adrenal cortical hormones are all steroid-based. So if I talk to you about another hormone, such as thyroid hormone, that is going to be made from proteins. Okay, so any other hormone that we talk about, growth hormone, proteins, insulin, proteins, protein-based, okay, or amino acid-based. Okay, so the rest of the hormones will be protein-based. Okay, let's zoom back out. Okay, eicosanoids, you see that listing at the bottom. Remember I talked to you about locally released hormones. I've just given you two examples of that. Prostaglandins and leukotrienes are hormones that are released locally in an area when tissues or cells are damaged. So the damaged cells actually release their own hormones. Okay, the damaged cells release their own hormones. They're locally released. They create that immediate response. Histamine would be another example. Okay, the reason I put prostaglandins and leukotrienes is prostaglandins is all over the body and actually has so many different effects. There's different types of prostaglandins. They all have different effects. Some are pro-inflammatory, some are anti-inflammatory. It depends on where it is and what's happening. Okay, so that opens up a whole other can of worms. Leukotrienes I put down. Leukotrienes is going to be a locally released, hormone that we're going to see is a strong instigator of that asthmatic response in the lungs, leukotrienes. And there are some medications that are used specifically to counteract the effects of leukotrienes, okay? So those are locally released in tissues. They're released from the cells themselves and they affect the surrounding cells as well as themselves. Now that being said, I want to zip in on the whiteboard again because there's two other things that we need to talk about. So those locally released hormones can either be autocrine or paracrine. Okay, so autocrine or paracrine. The prefix auto means self. So when we're talking about those eicosanoids, they can be an autocrine or a paracrine. Autocrine is going to be a cell that secretes a hormone that affects itself. Paracrine will be a cell that releases hormone that affects the cells around it. Okay, so a fine distinction, but autocrine versus paracrine is going to have different effects either on the cell itself or it'll affect the cells around it. Okay. What do they do? Gosh, this is such a broad topic. This topic could be a whole class unto itself because there are so many effects that these hormones have. You could have one hormone that will have different effects on different tissues, okay? The reason that happens is because when hormones are released into the bloodstream, that hormone isn't going to go out and affect every cell in the body, okay? That hormone is not going to go out and affect every cell in the body. That hormone goes out and finds specific cells that it is meant to attach to, okay? Target cell specificity. So that hormone is going to go out and find cells that it is meant to attach to. There are specific hormones that will release those gonadal hormones. They're actually released from the brain. They go into the bloodstream. Okay, they'll go to the ovaries or the testes and just affect them. They don't go to other cells because, I want you to think about it for a second, why would it not affect other cells? Because those other cells don't have receptors on the surface for that hormone. Okay, so hormones have to be released, but they also have to go to cells that have specific receptors for them in order to make changes in that cell. Okay, amino acid based cells. Okay, now I'm going to just look at the notes, read this through, think about it for a second, and then I'm going to draw a picture on the board. Amino acids based cells cannot go directly into a cell. I'm going to explain to you why in just a minute. Steroid-based cells or steroid-based hormones can go into a cell. Okay, if you go back to, once again, ANP1. So we're talking about how these hormones enter cells. And this will come into play clinically when you start to talk about medications. Okay? Going back to ANP1, here's our little cell. Okay? The cell membrane is phospholipid bilayer. Okay, the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. So it's made up of phosphorus and it's made up of lipids that makes it semi-permeable. We don't want everything to get into and out of the cells. We want to be selective. Okay, so the phospholipid bilayer makes the cell semi-permeable. That cell decides who's going to come in, who's going to go out. Okay, the cell is primarily made up of fat. There's phospholipids as well, or there's phosphorus as well. Okay, but it's primarily made up of fat. So fats have an easier time passing through that because they don't go against each other. Okay. Steroid-based hormones can pass right through the cell membrane. Okay, so steroid-based hormones because it's fat soluble, it can pass through that phospholipid bilayer. It could go right into the cell and make the changes that it needs to make, and I'll tell you what those changes are in just a second. Okay. Protein or amino acid based hormones. They have to come to the surface to cell surface receptors and then they talk to the inside of the cell. It's almost like that game of telephone that you used to play when you were young, except the message gets through correctly. Okay, they need to pass this message through receptors that then, they're called second messengers, talk to the inside of the cell. I'll tell you what it does in just a second. Okay, so amino acid based hormones, that's receptor, that word right there, have to attach to receptors, and then they talk to the inside of the cell with second messengers. Okay. They don't actually go into the cell. They attach to cell surface receptors, talk to the inside of the cell via second messengers. And there's a whole, this is a whole science unto itself. I'm simplifying this immensely. Okay. There's a whole different type of second messengers that are used on the inside of the cell. I'm just trying to give you an overview of this. Okay. So steroid-based can pass right through. Amino acid need to attach to receptors and then inside the cell. Now, either way, when either one of them come inside, their primary job is going to be to create proteins. Okay. That whole DNA sequencing inside the cell gives us the sequence of proteins. And if you remember back to ANP1, once again, proteins are going to form the structures of the body. The whole purpose of hormones is to be going out to specific cells and telling them, hey, it's time to turn on, it's time to create more proteins and affect the structure of our body. Let me give you a little example. Okay, growth hormone. As a child reaches puberty and they start to grow, they're going to release, well, the whole time they're growing, they're releasing growth hormone. Okay, that growth hormone is released. Its primary job, we have this listed, don't worry about writing it down yet. Growth hormone's primary job is to grow bones and muscles. Growth hormone will go to the bone and muscle cells. It is amino acid based. It attaches to cell surface receptors. It sends a second messenger to the nucleus and tells it to make more proteins in that area. Okay, build up whatever muscles or bones that need to be built up. Okay. Same thing with testosterone. As a boy starts to grow, he releases testosterone. That will also affect bones and muscles, make them grow bigger and stronger than females. Okay, testosterone is more efficient at that. That testosterone, steroid based, it walks right through that plasma membrane, talks to the nucleus, or it just makes proteins directly. Okay, two ways of doing that, but don't worry about it. Okay, it's going to make proteins in the skeletal muscle in the bone. It's going to make boys bigger and, sorry, ladies, but stronger than we are. Okay, so that is the effect, the very basic explanation of how hormones are going to go into the cell and affect those cells. Okay. All right. Once again, pause the tape. If you have any questions, go back and review it. Shoot me an email. I'd be happy to get back to you. Target cell specificity. I went over this actually already. So once again, a hormone, when it's released, is going to go to a very specific area. It's a lock and key mechanism. Okay, that hormone is the key. The lock is on the cell. The hormone is released. It's looking for the right match. Okay, it finds the cell that it fits into, and it makes that cell produce more proteins. Okay, very specific. Control of hormone release. Okay, I'm going to zoom in on this screen because I see that it's not easy to see from there, and you don't need to see any pictures at this point. So there's different ways that hormones are released. There's humoral. Humoral in old times, when they first started studying anatomy and physiology, the humors of the body were the fluids in the body. Over time, humoral has really come to reference blood. Okay, so our body's constantly monitoring the level of hormones and substances in the blood, okay, and the change in concentrations. The humoral response will start to stimulate the endocrine system or the glandular system to release hormones if we have a lowering level of those hormones, okay. Neural, nerve fibers. A great example of this is going to be sympathetic stimulation. So sympathetic stimulation, if you remember, is fight or flight. If we have a fight or flight response, so somebody comes in, you're listening to the tape right now, and they scream boo in your ear, you're going to jump up, you're going to have a sympathetic response, fight or flight. And the nerves of the sympathetic nervous system actually travel down to a part of the endocrine system that stimulates the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, now epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. Adrenaline gives us that, that super strength, right? You've heard of mothers whose childs are trapped under the car and they can lift the car. That's because of a huge shot of adrenaline that's released, okay? Hormonal control or release of hormones. One endocrine gland stimulating another. So the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, target organ. We're going to talk about that. And I actually want to back up to this picture. Okay, I'd like to back up to this picture. You may not be able to see the words in this picture. So if you can't, once again, pause the tape and this is directly from the book. There's one very close to it in your book. I want you to get that out. I want to give you just a general overall of all these different hormones, or all these different glands. Okay, so I'm going to go back out to the camera. That's too small, isn't it? Yeah, I can talk you through on a tighter picture. Okay, so starting at the top, we're actually going to go through all of these glands. Okay, pineal gland is in the back of the brain. It's like a little pea-sized gland. It's also known as the third eye. It helps to regulate sleep patterns. This is all in the notes, so just listen and look at the pictures for just a second. Okay, there's a little area underneath the thalamus called the hypothalamus. Hypo meaning below the thalamus. That area is the area that actually release substances called releasing hormones. The releasing hormones go down to the pituitary gland. I'm going to show you a drawing in just a minute of how that happens. So there's a little stalk between the hypothalamus and the pituitary called the infundibulum. Okay, the hypothalamus is constantly talking to the pineal gland, telling it to release. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 theoretically 9 hormones that are released from the pineal gland that affects every function of the body. Okay. Pituitary. I'm sorry. Hypothalamus connects to the pituitary gland, not pineal. Sorry about that. Okay. Thyroid gland is going to be in the front of the throat. It's a butterfly-shaped organ. If you were to pinch that thyroid gland as you're looking at somebody, if you dissect that out, you're looking at a cadaver, you would feel on the back of the thyroid, the parathyroid glands, okay? They feel like little pea-shaped structures. They're embedded right on the back side of the thyroid gland. And even though they're on the back side of the thyroid, though, they're very distinct gland that does very distinct things, okay? We'll talk about that in a little bit. Behind the sternum is the thymus. The thymus is very important in immune response. The adrenal glands, if you take a look, they sit right on the top of the kidneys. They're also known as the suprarenal glands. Supra meaning above, renal meaning kidney. Okay, right across the stomach we have the pancreas. Pancreas is super important with the regulation of sugars in the body and also with digestive enzymes. Ovaries in females, okay, will be in the abdominal pelvis, and testes in males would be in the scrotal sac. Okay, so quick little overview. If you want to take a minute, pause the tape, look at those, that might be a good idea. Okay, so bumping ahead. So control of hormonal release, we finished. Okay, major endocrine organs. So I'm going to zoom back out. And I want to talk to you about the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Okay, so hypothalamus is going to be below the thalamus. It's going to be a little section of brain. It's not a real specific structure like the pituitary actually looks like a little pea. It's not like that. It's more of a generalized area, the hypothalamus. And you can't see that at all. What am I doing? Okay, so this is super blown up. Okay, this is super duper blown up. Oh, I've got to zoom in too. Okay, so the hypothalamus is just a generalized area in the brain that's going to be below the thalamus. It's connected to the pituitary, which looks like a little pea. Okay, so this is going to be hypothalamus. Here's the pituitary. And it's connected by a little stalk of tissue called the infundibulum. Okay. So hypothalamus, infundibulum connects it to the pituitary. They need this direct connection. There's a lot of information and hormones that are sent between the hypothalamus and the pituitary all the time to regulate bodily functions. Now these are going to be right in the center of the brain. Okay, they're going to be right in the center of the brain. So pituitary gland is what we're going to be talking about next. Okay. Pituitary gland, I'm going to zoom in on the PowerPoint, sits in what's called the sella turcica. Okay, if you want to take a second and look that up in your lecture book, that might be a good idea. The sella turcica is known as the Turkish saddle. It's a little saddle-looking structure in the center of the sphenoid bone. Okay, the sphenoid bone sits in the skull. And that little sella turcica, that little piece of bone in the sphenoid, creates a nice saddle-shaped structure to protect the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is super important. If something goes wrong with that, all your hormones can get messed up, which would be a bad thing. Okay? We're going to talk about the 9 hormones. I actually have a mnemonic for you. A stalk or infundibulum connects to the hypothalamus. Okay, that's that stalk of neural tissue. And actually, there's some vascular tissue in there too. The pituitary is broken up into 2 parts. There's the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Okay, so anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is comprised of nerve fibers. Okay, the posterior pituitary is comprised of nerve fibers. It's actually derived from brain tissue, embryologically speaking. The anterior pituitary is created of closely packed cells. So if you look at them through a microscope, the anterior pituitary would be closely packed cells looking like a gland. The posterior pituitary would be comprised of nerve fibers. Okay? Now, the posterior pituitary is going to release oxytocin and ADH. Okay, the posterior is going to release oxytocin and ADH. Now, the reason that this is important is two things. ADH is anti-diuretic hormone. Okay, anti-diuretic hormone. So anti means obviously against. Diuresis is urination. So anti-diuretic hormone will be released when we need to retain fluid. Now, why, think for a second, would you need to retain fluid? You need to retain fluid because the volume of fluid in your body will increase and it'll actually raise blood pressure. We think of blood pressure as, oh, we don't want it too high. Well, we also don't want it too low. You need to have that nice, decent range of blood pressure so we can get blood out into the tissues of the body and perfuse those tissues and get oxygen and nutrients out to the tissues, okay? So if blood pressure gets too low, we can't do that. There's not enough force in the vascular system to get the fluids out to those tissues and perfuse them, okay? So antidiuretic hormone is released. It prevents diuresis, it retains fluid, and it will raise blood pressure. Okay? It can also dilute substances in the blood as well. So antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin is another hormone released from the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin actually has a couple of effects. The main one is going to be the perpetuation of uterine contractions with birth. Yay, right? Okay, so when the baby decides it's time, oxytocin will be released. Oxytocin perpetuates those contractions. Okay, oxytocin is also known as the cuddle hormone. It's released after sex. It creates bonding between paired couples. Okay, you know, tries to get us to establish that bond with somebody. Okay, so oxytocin. Now, anterior pituitary, I want to just give you a brief mnemonic, and we're going to talk about this in lab as well. Okay. Just want to see something really quick. Good. Okay, so anterior pituitary is going to release, great mnemonic, flat peg. I'm going to go through every one of these hormones with you. Other than endorphins, but I could tell you briefly what those do. I can just give you this mnemonic of anterior pituitary hormones so you can remember which hormones the anterior pituitary releases. Okay, so follicle stimulating hormone. I'm just going to use H for hormone. Luteinizing hormone. Is that big enough? ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone. Prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone. So we're going to talk about all of them except for endorphins. Endorphins actually help to inhibit pain signals. They do other things as well. They're an inhibiting hormone as well, but endorphins will help with pain signals. Okay, they help to decrease pain. Endorphins. Okay. Endorphins are involved with that runner's high. If you know somebody who runs a long distance, they can start running, and after a while the endorphins kick in, they can't feel pain as much. Okay, so we've got these hormones that are going to be all from the anterior pituitary. Okay. Let's zoom back out. Okay. This slide kind of gives you some of the target organs of the pituitary. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I think it's a little confusing. Okay. Adenohypophyseal hormones. Once again, we have all these different names for similar structure. The adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary. Okay, so the adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary. It is going to be stimulated by the hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus is going to release substances called releasing hormones. Those releasing hormones will go to the anterior pituitary. It'll stimulate the anterior pituitary to release hormones out into the blood. Okay, so hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, blood is what to remember. Okay, so I've got those listed. I want you to remember the flat pack is a little bit more inclusive, all-inclusive. Okay, so growth hormone, yay, one that makes sense, is going to target bones and muscles and make them grow. Now, it's stimulated by, I give you the stimulating and the inhibiting ones. I'm not going to go over them. I'm probably not going to test, I'm not going to test you on them. Okay, but they're there. A lot of them just make sense. Growth hormone targets bone and skeletal muscle, promotes them to grow. It starts to wane as we get older. If you've seen those ads for people in their upper years, I'll say, who are going to this institute out west and getting these injections, and now they're big and strong and they look like they have bigger muscles than Arnold Schwarzenegger, well, it's because they're getting these injections of growth hormone. Okay, and growth hormone will indeed grow the muscles and bones, but there's also some correlations with them also growing areas that are beginning of cancer. So it's not, I think, significantly studied yet. I'm not sure. If you know, shoot me an email. Okay, but I do believe that there's some correlation with the propagation or perpetuation of cancerous cells. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, this is going to stimulate the thyroid. The thyroid is very important in the regulation of metabolism. Okay, if we don't have enough thyroid hormones, our metabolism will decrease. If we have too much, our metabolism will increase too much. Okay, so we have the releasing and the inhibiting hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. The adrenal cortex sits on top of the adrenal glands. We looked at that picture before. Okay, so ACTH is the hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary, travels by the blood down to the adrenal cortex. Oh, I need to tell you what the adrenal cortex is. Here, let's zoom in here. Okay, so imagine we're looking at the adrenal glands sitting on top of the kidneys once again. Okay, so here's our kidneys. Okay, they're paired structures. On top of them, we have this somewhat triangular shaped gland called the suprarenal gland, okay, or the adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland is sort of a triangle shape. If you dissect it out on a human being, it's more mushy than that, but we always draw it as a triangle. So if I blow up that triangle, there's actually two major parts to it. There's the outer portion called the adrenal cortex. Okay, we're going to talk specifically about the adrenal cortex today. It has several hormones that are released that help us deal with stress. The inner portion is the adrenal medulla. Okay, the adrenal medulla is going to be stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine in stressful situations. Okay, so this is the two parts of the adrenal cortex. Okay, so adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to affect the adrenal cortex, that outer portion. The adrenal medulla will be stimulated by sympathetic nerves. Okay, gonadotropins. So gonadotropins are follicle stimulating hormone that we talked about in the flat pag and luteinizing hormone. Okay, so they're both grouped under gonadotropins because they both affect the gonads. Okay, now follicle stimulating hormone is very important with the maturation and the release of eggs in females and sperm in males. Okay, so follicles or follicle is another word for or generalized term for an egg or a sperm. Luteinizing hormone is going to be released to help release those gonadal hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. Okay, so follicle stimulating hormone is going to deal with the release of egg or sperm. Luteinizing hormone deals with the release of the hormones. Okay, prolactin, prolactation. This will stimulate the release of milk in a lactating female. Okay, prolactin. this would be a dangerous sign if somebody is not nursing, okay? It could mean that there's a tumor somewhere in the hypothalamus, somewhere in the pituitary, possibly somewhere in the breast, but more likely in the endocrine glands. Okay, so if there's lactation or the secreting of substance from the nipple, that is a bad sign and you need to be checked, okay? Prolactin can affect testosterone in males as well. Okay, posterior pituitary, we talked about this. Antidiuretic hormone influences body water balance, prevents diuresis, retains fluid, increases blood pressure, dilutes the blood. Oxytocin contracts smooth muscle, especially the uterus and the breast, okay? Oxytocin, and I left this out, I forgot to mention this before, also helps with milk letdown, and we'll talk about this in reproductive. So if a female is pregnant, she gives birth, she decides to breastfeed, prolactin makes the milk, oxytocin helps with the letdown reflex, okay? We'll talk about that in reproductive. Thyroid gland. I'm going to take a break, pause the tape, and I'll be right back.